This is the fifth installment of the summer series here at Furman. It's beginning to have the feel somewhat of a friendly reunion. A lot of recognizable faces out in the crowd, folks that have been here for each and every one of these series. Welcome back for those of you, and if you're here for the first time, welcome to you as well. This is a very integral part of what the Riley Institute does, and you have to say that the summer series provides incredibly valuable context to important public policy issues, most of which are extremely complex, providing no easy answers, but we have the forum here to dissect these and talk about them in a way where we can find some common ground and hopefully some solutions and maybe provide some answers to some very vexing, troubling questions. And one of those public policy issues that confounds many people who are elected officials and business leaders and people in this state is the issue of justice, disparities of justice, and of course, how do we deal with people who have gone wrong? Are we fair about the way in which we do that? I would just say for many years covering politics when I was in the media, you know, if you were running for public office, there was just one thing that you had to say, had to be part of your platforms. I am going to be tough on crime. That was just the way it was. Anything less than that, chances are you were not going to be elected. But increasingly here in recent years, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, the evidence suggests that perhaps we're not getting our money's worth with our correctional system. Perhaps we are wasting tax dollars, and that's got the attention of an awful lot of politicians. And so now, increasingly, you hear more about being smart on crime, transitioning away from being tough on crime and being smart on crime. And this is some of the conversations we'll have over the next 4 weeks. To help provide context of some of the topics that we'll be discussing here over the course of the summer series, please let me introduce the president of Furman University, Dr. Elizabeth Davis.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening. Welcome to Furman University and to Crime and Punishment, Thinking Outside the Cell, presented by the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, better known as OLLI at Furman, and the Riley Institute at Furman. OLLI at Furman is directed by Nancy Kennedy, and the Riley Institute is directed by Dr. Don Gordon. Let's take a minute to thank both of them for their leadership. The partnership between these institutions brings us this highly regarded annual series that looks at critical issues facing South Carolina. And as Mark said, today marks the beginning of our 5th year hosting the series, and we're glad that you're here to be a part. Tonight we have the honor of hearing from a noted historian who has written prolifically about incarceration in the United States, Dr. Heather Thompson. Dr. Thompson, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here at Furman University. We're delighted to have you here to share your compelling research on this critical issue. We're also honored to have with us 3 state legislators tonight. Our very own Chandra Dillard. When you see us side by side, you'll think we're twins. We dressed exactly alike tonight. Chandra Dillard, State Representative for District 23, is here, and we're very pleased to have with us Representative Tommy Pope, who we'll hear from a little bit later this evening. Senator Gerald Malloy is running late, but he should make it in time to offer some remarks. I know it's been an extremely challenging, emotional, and difficult time for each of you in your service to our state these last few weeks. So I want to express my gratitude to you and your colleagues for thoughtfully and respectfully considering the issue of the Confederate flag flying on the State House grounds. Taking the flag down was the right thing to do, and we look forward to a renewed commitment to advancing the great state of South Carolina to the benefit of all its constituents. Thank you. As I look across the room, it does my heart good to see so many people here to learn about this issue of reforming our system of criminal justice, which is receiving attention across a national stage. Just last week, President Obama visited a federal prison in Oklahoma to raise awareness of the United States as having, by far, the highest rate of incarceration in the world and to call for reform. Many Republicans are also calling for review and reform of our justice system. This is a long ignored issue with far-reaching consequences, and I'm glad you're here to deepen your understanding of it. As many of you know, I strongly feel that a democracy thrives only with an informed and engaged citizenry. Thank you for making the effort to be informed and engaged as we look together toward finding the best path forward for South Carolina. This time, I'd like to welcome to the podium Jill Fuson with the Riley Institute. Jill has been very instrumental in conceptualizing and coordinating the programming for this annual summer series since its inception 5 years ago. She's going to tell us a little more about this year's series and introduce our speaker. Jill.
Thank you, President Davis, and I would like to also add my welcome, and on behalf of the Riley Institute and Ollie at Furman, we are so glad to see all of you here for Crime and Punishment, Thinking Outside the Cell. I'm particularly impressed to see you here because crime and punishment really doesn't seem to be a very happy topic. In fact, and as you know, there is a lot about the topic that is unhappy, particularly in light of recent events. Our state is still healing after the murders of the Emanuel Nine. Controversial police shootings in Ferguson, Baltimore, North Charleston have eroded trust in law enforcement. We often treat folks with mental illness as criminals first and patients a distant second. And the huge increase in the number of individuals incarcerated over the last 4 decades, which has shown no ability to decrease crime, has been devastating for millions of individuals, families, and communities, particularly communities of color. When we think about crime and punishment, what comes to mind? The phrase conjures up all levels and iterations of wrongful actions and consequences for those actions. Perhaps you think first of the actions of Dylann Roof, an example of the worst sort of crime demanding the worst sort of punishment. Or maybe you think about human trafficking or domestic abuse, both of which are huge issues in South Carolina. Several of us in this room may know someone who has been a victim of a violent crime, such as rape, assault and battery, or even murder, again, which brings to mind the Emanuel Nine. Some of us ourselves may have been a victim of crime, or perhaps during our youth, some of us may have even committed a crime, maybe something small like shoplifting or smoking marijuana, and maybe we don't have any criminal record to show for it. And punishment, what do we see as the value of punishment? If it is to teach a lesson, how good of a job are we doing in South Carolina? If it is to deter crime and improve public safety, are we achieving that goal? Or is punishment by incarceration simply a vehicle for keeping folks locked up so we don't have to worry about them anymore? Out of sight, out of mind. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look carefully at this question of crime and punishment. And we begin tonight by asking the first question, does the punishment fit the crime? We'll begin with a broad perspective by Dr. Heather Thompson, and then we'll turn our attention to South Carolina when we hear from Senator Malloy and from Representative Pope. And I'd like to say there is good news for South Carolina. Our state is leading the nation in sentencing reform. Can you imagine? We're leading the nation in something good. And that is lowering the incarceration rate and saving our state millions of dollars. In addition to pioneering public policy, there is on-the-ground change occurring, and we are going to hear from many of these agents of change in the coming weeks. Next week, July 28th, we start with a look at prisons, police, and public safety. And we'll begin with a conversation around law enforcement and the communities they serve. We're going to hear from Charleston Chief of Police Greg Mullen, Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott, Greenville's own Peyton Blau, who is a mental health advocate, and Darian Blue, the pastor of Nicholtown Baptist Church. And also Glenn Smith, a crime reporter from the Post and Courier, because we all know the media definitely have a role to play in how we perceive crime and how we perceive our police. Following that, we are going to hear a sobering and often overlooked story of how South Carolina treats its mentally ill prisoners by Stuart Andrews, the plaintiff's attorney, who won the 2014 case against the South Carolina Department of Corrections on behalf of 3,500 mentally ill patients. And then the South Carolina Department of Corrections director will be here himself, Brian Sterling, as well as the director of, I always mix these up, Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services, Jerry Adger. Week 3 then is August 4th, and that will bring us a look at problem-solving courts featuring U.S. federal judge, Brucey Hendricks, and we're so glad you're here. And we will have 2 graduates of this bridge program who are going to tell their personal stories, as well as hearing from U.S. Probation Officer Brent Metcalf and Judge Chuck Simmons. And then the last week of the series, we will hear about second chances. First, we're going to hear from United States Attorney Bill Nettles, who has overseen a unique drug market intervention program in several South Carolina communities. And then we will hear from those on the front lines who are supporting reentry efforts for people with criminal backgrounds. And then finally, our very last speaker of the series will be the Senior Director of Recruitment from the #1 hospital in the country for 22 years and counting, Johns Hopkins. She will share the hospital's story of success in employing people with criminal backgrounds. As one journalist put it, a crucial ingredient in the rehabilitation of prisoners is hope. Over the next 4 weeks, we want to acknowledge and understand the problems in our justice system. And we also want to look for hope, the hope that we can share. So first, we're going to lay the groundwork with Dr. Heather Thompson, our keynote speaker. She is a woman on the move. She has been moving from Philadelphia, where she was at Temple University, to the University of Michigan, where she is now professor of history in the departments of Afro-American and African Studies and History. Dr. Thompson writes about the history as well as current crises of mass incarceration in scholarly publications and has also been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Salon, and the Huffington Post. Several of Dr. Thompson's scholarly pieces, including Why Mass Incarceration Matters, have won Best Article awards. Dr. Thompson is a Soros Justice Fellow, sits on the board of the Prison Policy Initiative, and recently served as well on a National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel to study causes and consequences of incarceration in the United States. Dr. Thompson was also named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Heather Thompson.
So good evening. Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you so much to Furman University, Dr. Davis, the Riley Institute, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and really all of you for being here. I mean, having community members is the best place to give a talk because, of course, all of this only matters because it matters to where we live and what we experience every day in our lives. And so my job, as I see it, is to, well, first of all, let me back up and say I'm a historian. So I promise not to bore you, but I also promise to give you very few solutions to the problems tonight. I'm going to leave that to the legislators, who I'm also very grateful to have here tonight. But what I am here to do is to draw some, or lay some groundwork to persuade you what I think most of you have already been persuaded of just simply watching the news lately, which is why it is that this issue matters so much to us as community members, as American citizens, as folks that are raising children or grandchildren, why it is that mass incarceration matters in America. And to do that, one of the things that I first want to do is just walk us through some kind of basic factoids, some fact information to give us a sense of why it is that we are all here today, what the crisis is that brings us here today. And what I want to actually suggest, I'm going to talk about money, I'm going to talk about the budget and all kinds of good reasons why we might do this, but actually I want to approach this talk to suggest to you that mass incarceration, the state we find ourselves in right now, is actually a major civil rights crisis. I would actually argue that it is the civil rights crisis of the 21st century. And that's a huge statement to make, because when we think of civil rights, we think of all kinds of things. For example, poverty, or racial inequality, or injustices in in many different areas of our lives. And you might think, well, why mass incarceration? Why is that the civil rights crisis? And what I want to persuade you is that it's because it actually exacerbates all other inequalities, all other social problems that we face as a society, all things that we seek to make better. The way we have handled our justice system actually makes those things much, much worse. So I actually will approach this from the point of view not even so much of those who are incarcerated or those who are incarcerating them, but actually from the perspective of the community. What impact has all of this had on us as citizens? The good news for me is that I'm not the only one talking about this now. I must say about 5 years ago, I felt like I was speaking a foreign language when I would give this talk. The great news is I think we have much bipartisan and widespread community support for the fact that we need to do something about this. I had the honor recently to speak in Washington, D.C. at this kind of historic bipartisan summit on criminal justice reform. And I must say it was a little surreal to be speaking in the same place where we had on the one hand like Eric Holder, but also Newt Gingrich, but also the Koch brothers and also the ACLU all in the same room. My head was spinning. But I really take that to be a wonderful, wonderful sign. And the reason we were all in that room is that I think we've all woken up to the fact that we are now facing something that is quite dire for us all. What are we facing? We're facing something that we call mass incarceration. And I put this up really quickly, not to walk you through the specific numbers, but to impress you by the absolute magnitude of what we're talking about here. If you look at just how many people are in state prisons, it's actually only half the pie, right? This is a huge, huge apparatus that we call our criminal justice system. And that is really important that we realize that this is historically unprecedented. That is to say, never before in our history, never before in the history of any other country have we seen this many people that are locked behind bars. I'm not going to show that graphic. We also know that not only is it historically unprecedented, but it is internationally unparalleled. That is to say, we are a huge outlier on the globe. I've done this talk in Zurich. I've done this talk in Germany. I've done this talk everywhere, and they just shake their heads. Nobody can quite believe how many people we have incarcerated. And I don't need to tell you that this is not just any group of people locked up. This is a group of people that is way disproportionately people of color. And if I put that on our international graph, you get to see just how staggering not only our incarceration rates are, but actually how staggering it is when you figure in the incarceration, in this case, of African American men. I want to point out, this is South Carolina. These disparities mirror themselves across this nation. It doesn't matter what state we're looking at. The disparity, the racial disparity is quite severe. And while we talk a lot about Black men or Latino men, we also need to remember that this is also very much a crisis for women. The racial disparity for women is quite notable as well. And in fact, arguably, African American girls and women are being incarcerated at rates more precipitous than any other group right now. This is a quite shocking statistic. This is a quite shocking set of graphs, but I want to share with you that this is actually really a national problem. This racial disparity. We tend to throw the South under the bus quite a bit. Particularly when it comes to racial disparities. And I will point out to you that in Pennsylvania, where I've lived for the last 5 years, the racial disparity is far worse. The ratio of blacks to whites incarcerated in Pennsylvania is 9-to-1. In South Carolina, it's 4-to-1, just to give you a sense. So this is all of our issue. This is not a Southern issue. This is not a rural issue. It's not an urban issue. This is all of our issues. And while we're on the topic of what are we talking about, I want to be clear about something else, because there is a tendency, I think, when we look at these kinds of graphs and we say, whoa, wait a minute, why is it that we now lock up, almost 2 billion people, and why do we have almost 7 million people under correctional control? There's a secret part of us that's like, well, is it because crime is really bad? Is that why? And I'm going to talk about that for a minute, but let me just give you a heads up. No. And also, when it comes to the racial disparity, we're like, well, I don't know. Is it possible? Is it possible that it's because people of color commit more crime? The thing is, we're going to be mostly talking about nonviolent drug offenses, and the answer is just a flat-out no. We have to be really, really clear about what we're talking about. When we talk about both who is selling drugs, but also who is using drugs, it is simply not the case that people who are doing the crime are doing the time. And that is one of the reasons why we are all here. It's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. So, after all that kind of data overload, what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is mass incarceration matters because it affects everything. It affects our communities, it affects our economy, and it affects, and this is the really important one I think for all of us as citizens, it affects our very democracy. So I just want to walk us through those very quickly. First, the fate of our nation's poorest rural areas and cities. It's very important that when we look at cities and we look at rural areas and we see a lot of poverty or we see a lot of destitution, particularly I think about North Philadelphia where I'm from. I mean, it just looks ravaged. Parts of it just look ravaged. And I'm sure there's parts of South Carolina that feel like that and look like that when you go by them. And we have a lot of explanations. We say, well, you know, there's deindustrialization and there's globalization. And, you know, there's a lot of just, you know, there's always a lot of poverty, so there is that. And also, of course, there was a recession. And we have all kinds of explanations. But what we have begun to understand is that there's a huge elephant in the room that we have not paid attention to for the last 40 years as the incarceration rate has become astronomical. And that is the role that mass incarceration has played in destroying our rural areas and our major cities. That is the elephant in the room. What I am referring to is something different happens after the 1960s. Something happens to create this rise in incarceration. And what that something is called the criminalization of space. Often I speak of the criminalization of urban space, but for the purposes particularly of areas like South Carolina, we really want to talk about the criminalization of rural spaces and urban spaces. What is that? That is when all of a sudden things that were not illegal before become illegal, and things that were illegal before all of a sudden have really severe penalties, penalties disproportionate to what it was before. So this is actually an identifiable moment, something that changes that is going to have a tremendous impact on our criminal justice system. I'm going to talk about that, but let me just back up one smidge and ask a very obvious question, which is why? Why all of a sudden, in about 1965, do we start this criminalization of space? Well, guess what we all think, or at least we have thought for a very long time. We have thought, well, dirty secret, it's because in the 60s, crime got crazy. Crime was out of control. And it's kind of unfortunate that we ended up with mass incarceration, and maybe we overdid it, but the truth is we had to. There, I said it. Well, the wonderful thing about being a historian, there's many things that are not so wonderful, like you're persuading your students that you're not going to bore them to tears, but one of the things that's kind of amazing is you can actually go back and trace out what are a lot of public assumptions about the past and test it. And it turns out, guess what? Not true. We begin the war on crime in 1965, and what's the thing you notice most about 1965 on this graph? Which is that the murder rate hadn't been that low since about 1911. And I'll point out something else to you, which is the violent crime rate, which is we're very deeply concerned with. Yeah, crime does get pretty bad, but it actually becomes catastrophic and terrible after we have been well knee-deep in waging the war on crime. And in fact, when we began the war on crime, it was not historically remarkable. In fact, I bring your attention back. You had much greater a chance of being murdered during the Great Depression in the 20s and in the 1930s than you did in the 1960s, and a far greater chance of being victimized after we were well and deeply invested in the war on crime than before. So what gives? What gives is that we made a policy choice. It was not a crime imperative. And this is a fascinating story. I had the opportunity to work with 24, I believe, other folks on this study. We worked for 2 years on this, bringing all the best research and evidence at our disposal to ask, why did we start the war on crime? And it became very clear very quickly that we did so for political reasons. The first thing we need to know is that we did not begin the war on crime, as many would assume, with Richard Nixon, or even later with Ronald Reagan. Their hands are dirty too, but that happens a little later. We actually begin the war on crime with Lyndon Johnson. And it's a complicated story, but one of the reasons that we began the war on crime has everything to do with the civil rights movement. When the civil rights movement was South, many Southern governors and legislators and mayors and local politicians saw civil rights unrest as disorder, as crime, as criminality. And it was very easy for the Northern politicians to say, oh, what's the matter with you crackers? You know, go down there, we're going to teach you how to do civil rights. Well, guess what? Then the civil rights movement came north. And they said, wait a minute, you know, wait a second, because we're not racist. But of course, the reality was when the civil rights movement came north, and it came with a lot of deep-seated anger, of course, the laws may say one thing, but the reality is, why is there so much discrimination in jobs? Why is there so much discrimination in housing? And the North in 1964 explodes. We get urban rebellions in Philadelphia, in Harlem, in Rochester, all across the North. And all of a sudden, Northern politicians start to sound very much like Southern politicians. And civil unrest is the same thing as civil disorder, and civil disorder is very much breaking the law, and breaking the law is crimes. And all of a sudden, laws start to change. And guess what? We have been here before, by the way. And so Lyndon Johnson starts the war on crime. I'm jumping ahead of myself in 1964 with the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. That's the apparatus. That's what makes it possible to do everything we're going to do later on, okay? But we've been here before. Right after the American Civil War, when there was another huge civil rights moment, right? 4 million newly freed people who wanted places to live, wanted jobs. All across this region, all of a sudden, laws changed. Things that were not illegal became illegal. Things that had been illegal become excessively illegal. And for example, the Georgia State Penitentiary goes from being all white in 1865 to being virtually all black by 1879. Not because black folks lose their mind and white folks stop committing crimes, but because the policy changed. It was a political response to a political moment of civil rights unrest. So without belaboring the point, basically the same thing happens after 1965. And then we just add to it. This is why I say every politician, politicians are going to fix this. Politicians also created this. Lyndon Johnson starts it, but then of course we get a drug war that begins in New York City after one of the most amazing prison uprisings, which is the Attica State Prison Uprising, a huge civil rights protest. The response of that governor was to criminalize drugs, criminalize addiction with the Rockefeller drug laws. It just spread and spread. Pretty soon Michigan had a 650 lifer law. If you had 650 grams of cocaine, you get an automatic life sentence. And I'm no mathematician, but you know, that's not like Noriega here. You know, you could keep it in your car. And the point is that we began to criminalize addiction rather than treat it as a public health, the public health disaster that it was. And so pretty soon we began to see a dramatic spike in prison numbers. And this is just some of the data, but just consider in 1 decade alone the incredible increase in drug offense arrests and drug offense control in the criminal justice system. Again, I want to be clear here in case we have any kind of wondering what's happening, how this relates to racial disparity or who's getting arrested. We might think, again, that we're locking up everybody who is the kingpins, the people behind the Oz behind the curtain. But in fact, you see from the data, we overwhelmingly criminalize possession, not sales. And in fact, what's really interesting about it is that possession is very much equated with addiction. And we see this very clearly throughout the nation. This is 1982 to 2007. And again, I want to stress the racial disparity, which is where I was going with this. This is marijuana arrests in the 25 most populous counties in the United States. And it's not just a little bit disparate. It's not just sort of disparate. It is shockingly disparate, even though everybody is well aware that white people also like marijuana. Okay, so it's not pushers, it's addicts. It's not evenly distributed. In fact, African Americans make up about 13% of the population and also about 13% of the drug users, and we have this kind of disparity. But we also get mass incarceration because we don't just criminalize drugs, it's because we lock people up so much longer. And this is actually something really interesting because I too have become so part of what has become that it seems totally normal. Oh, you got a 20-year sentence. Oh, you got a 30-year sentence. Oh, you got life. And you stop and you go to another country, or you even look back on our own history and you just kind of have to shake your head a little bit. Like the amount of time that people do is shocking as well. Indeed, we start to get mandatory minimum sentences across the country, as we well know. We're going to talk about sentencing reform later today. But you get to see that the impact of this was quite great. We also see more life sentences being served than ever before in American history, a growing number of offenses that qualify for life sentences, and also an extraordinary number of juveniles serving life sentences. And one of the particular horror shows is juveniles serving life sentences without the opportunity for parole. Pennsylvania has 450 children now serving life sentences, many of them without the possibility of parole. Michigan is now second, I believe, 350 something. And here we have some great news for South Carolina because actually there's been some really fundamentally important reform with mandatory minimum sentences, particularly in in school zones and so forth in your state. So you're really to be applauded for that. But it's not so good everywhere else. And speaking of schools, that's the other way we began to add to mass incarceration, which was the criminalization of schools. Somewhere in this run-up to crime and run-up to incarceration, we got the idea that today's youth were particularly vicious, were particularly heinous, were particularly horrible. Actually, it's a very interesting story about where we got that idea from. There was actually one individual published a report that said that kids today were so much worse with all kinds of pseudoscientific evidence, and everybody started quoting this report, including the Surgeon General of the United States, and it turned out it was an absolute fabrication. Turns out that our kids are, yes, they are a pain in the you-know-what, but they are not particularly any more heinous than any other generation, like, say, even during Prohibition. And the difference is that we have dealt with child misbehavior in a completely different way through things like zero tolerance. We have created school police forces across our nation that now seem normal. But guess when we got police in the schools? Detroit, 1969. Baltimore, 1969. I believe Atlanta, 1967. We got police in the schools, and we got them into the specific schools where there was massive civil rights protests. And that was where we first saw the first police officers in school. And pretty soon, police just became absolutely part of the fabric of schools, so much so that the school district of Philadelphia eventually had the 10th largest police force in the entire country. And indeed, here, South Carolina was not faring so well, and thus the importance of reforming in the 2009 to 2010 school year, more than 103,000 suspensions in your state, and 3,900 of them were suspended. And of course, we know from the data that from suspensions and expulsions comes dropping out of high school, and from dropping out of high school comes a direct prison pipeline. So, and of course, this is much younger and younger kids. This is a quite famous story, recent story. This is in the Bronx. This is a little kid who was having a fight on the playground with his friend about $5. His friend said he had taken $5. He said he didn't. And next thing you know, the police are called. He is handcuffed, taken away in a paddy wagon. This picture was actually taken where he was locked up, and before anyone was alerted, his parents or anybody. And this picture is just very symbolic, not as a criticism of the prosecutor, not even a criticism of the police, not a criticism of the teacher, as a criticism of the entire apparatus, that we begin to see a 7-year-old child as a predator, as a threat, as someone in need of handcuffs, as someone in need of a paddy wagon and prosecution. So needless to say, all of this has had enormous fallout for our poor rural areas and certain areas of our cities. Because again, it isn't just that it's racially disproportionate, it's also income disproportionate. So it's the most fragile communities that have borne the brunt of this most directly. In short, mass incarceration has torn at the fabric of our communities in ways that we are only just now waking up to. Because for so long we're like, well, it's because there's no jobs here. Or it's because there's not this here, there's not this here. And we quickly find out, no, it's actually directly related to incarceration. We literally have eroded our neighborhoods. I mean physically eroded our neighborhoods. There's entire areas that we refer to as million-dollar blocks. Million-dollar blocks are the name given to parts of the city or community where everybody's locked up. And supposedly it costs $1 million to put them all in jail. Of course, that's a deeply conservative estimate. It's a whole lot more than $1 million. But what this looks like, you all heard about Detroit in the news, bankruptcy, Detroit the worst of the worst. Nobody wants to move to Detroit except for my mother who wants me to move to Detroit because that's where I'm from. This is Detroit. This is the east side of Detroit, which used to be one of the most vibrant communities in the entire city. 1 in 22 adults under some form of correctional supervision. And in one neighborhood, Brewer Park, very famous area, 1 in 16 adults under some form of correctional supervision. So I don't have to tell you, when I say this literally erodes a neighborhood, this means that there's no one repairing houses, there's nobody providing for children, there is nobody that's able to turn lights on or mow lawns, whatever. It literally destroys neighborhoods. And this is Detroit, but it could be any city. And when you have a neighborhood that looks like that, the next thing that happens is you see a wholesale orphaning of children. Today, more than 2 million children. 1 in 14 African-American children is the conservative estimate. The probably more likely estimate is 1 in 7 African-American children have a parent or a caretaker incarcerated. The majority of these kids are under the age of 10. And indeed, this has had dramatic impacts on everything from schooling to, again, neighborhood cohesion. We know that this has been a real problem for our foster care system. For those of you who might work in the social services, it has had a dramatic effect on schools. We now see teachers that are reporting post-traumatic stress in the classroom from very young ages of children, essentially from this kind of trauma of the drug war working out in their own neighborhoods. And you might say, well, then why are their parents selling drugs? Well, here's one of the ironies of all ironies of where we have ended up. Mass incarceration does not just orphan children, it also creates in itself joblessness and poverty. So in areas where there is already very few jobs, by making drugs illegal and giving them that kind of cachet, you have created an incredibly viable, albeit extremely violent and dangerous, economy. That economy puts people in jail. But in turn, when those people get out, they are rendered permanently unemployable. Because as you know, if you have a criminal conviction, we know from interviewing employers that no one wants to hire someone that spent time in prison, so we know that people are permanently unemployable. Indeed, in Philadelphia, where I've spent most of the last 5 years, 50 to 70% of people on parole are permanently unemployed, and of those who do have jobs, their income potential, their earnings are dramatically lower than they would have been had they not gone to prison. So then, okay, well, they can't get a job. Well, what about welfare? How about that? Because in our society, if you can't work, you're trying to work, maybe you can get some welfare. Well, no, not so much. Because one of the things that happened when the criminal justice system grew so large is that it was wedded to the welfare system. And so if you had a conviction, particularly for a drug felony, in most places, you automatically were then unqualified to receive food aid, housing aid, even if you had children who needed that aid. And so there's no welfare, there's no jobs, and drugs are still illegal. And then lo and behold, we begin to see this vicious, repetitive cycle of incarceration and unemployment. It is also interesting to note that even with welfare, even at the moment when we began to change our welfare system, end welfare as we know it under the Clinton administration, we had already surpassed spending on incarceration. We'd surpassed AFDC, which was what it used to be called, by 130%, and we, excuse me, 130%, and we had already surpassed spending on food stamps by about 70%. So there wasn't even that much to go around, even if it was able to go around for everybody who needed it. The other thing is, of course, in addition to joblessness and poverty, it has had another long reach in our communities, which is our public health. For those of you in here who might be public health professionals, you know that, for example, in New York City, there was a terrible outbreak of tuberculosis that was directly traced to Rikers Island. We know that hospital MRSA, you know, when we go to the hospital and we're terrified of MRSA, we know that in Texas, the MRSA crisis has been directly tracked to the Texas prison system. And again, this has to do with the high level of overcrowding, the high level of crisis that we have with incarceration. And what does this all add up to? This effectively means that even if you don't know anyone that's incarcerated, even if you've never met anyone, even if you could care less about this whole thing because it's kind of an ugly story, the fact of the matter is we are all affected by it because we are all citizens. I want to just move forward really quickly to wrap this up to point out that it has also affected our economy in ways that would probably not surprise you at all, because if it affects our cities, it probably also affects our economy. And this too has a 19th century corollary. Right after the Civil War, we criminalized black space in all new ways. We made things crimes that were not crimes before. We completely altered the demographic profile of our criminal justice system in the South. And then we put those people to work. Okay? And I'm now seeing I'm running out of time. Boy, that was really quick. Have I been talking 45 minutes? Wow. Okay. I'm going to run ahead. So needless to say, right after the Civil War, we criminalized space. We also put people to work. We got prison labor. Well, then we got rid of it during the New Deal. We got rid of that as a key part of our workforce. We got rid of all of these things that would have perhaps put people on the outside at an advantage, that would have not disadvantaged workers on the outside. And after 1979, we re-accessed prison labor, and all of a sudden, federal prisons become part of the workforce again, state prisons become part of the workforce again, and indeed, private companies began to be able to access prisoner labor for the first time in many, many, many decades, as they do now. And that actually distorted our economy. We can look at this from an economist's point of view. We can see that this definitely distorted our economy. And to add to that, we also put a private property, excuse me, I got too many P's here. A profit motive attendant to imprisonment. So we got the building of prisons, the servicing of prisons, the actual connection between the stock market and prison building in ways that are quite alarming. So since I have so little time here, I'm going to rush forward and ask you a question, which is, if everything I'm telling you is true, and just for the sake of argument, trust me that it is, why haven't we changed this? We are all, as citizens, good people, I think, kind people, good-hearted people, people who would not want somebody else's child to be treated differently than our own, someone else's grandchild to be treated differently than our own. Why haven't we changed this? Well, one of the dirty secrets is that even though we are being educated about mass incarceration, and we are being told that this is maybe not a good way of doing things because it's too expensive, because it's immoral, for whatever reason that might bring us to this table, there's a part of many of us that are secretly wondering, did it work though? Did it kind of work? It's kind of ugly, I know, but did it work? Especially when we're being told that the crime rate is at an all-time low, things are looking up. You know, we haven't had a violent crime rate this low in a long time. And there's a secret part of people, like if you go to New York City right now and you go to Times Square, I mean, I'm not going to lie, like it used to be kind of a little scary in Times Square, and now I can take my daughter on the roller coaster in Toys R Us and it's all happy, it's all good. And there's a part of that criminalization of space that people have benefited from through gentrification and people have kind of felt good about. Of course, all that stuff in Times Square just got moved over to one of those $1 million blocks in Bed-Stuy, but we don't have to see it. So maybe it's working, maybe it's okay. Well, here's the thing. We have studied this thing within an inch of its life. The incarceration rate over the last 40 years has skyrocketed. It's done nothing but go up. The crime rate goes like this. The crime rate is not connected in the ways we assume to the incarceration rate. And this is a hard sell, believe me. We get a lot of pushback on this. I did a briefing in the House Judiciary Committee, the Senate. They're like, no, it can't be. It is. And the way we know this actually is because I just showed you the homicide rates, right? The 20s, we didn't respond to the high murder rate of the 20s by locking everybody up. And guess what? Crime went down. Actually, you know what was one of the things that brought the crime rate down? Getting rid of prohibition. Because guess what? Anybody watch Boardwalk Empire? When you make things illegal like that, and we can talk about how much things should be illegal or not illegal, but the one thing about criminalization is it increases violence. So the dirty secret is that while incarceration has not had an appreciable effect on the overall crime rate, it has made certain communities incredibly dangerous. It has had a terrible effect on the communities most impacted by it. It has appreciably increased the violence rate in areas most devastated by incarceration. And why should we be surprised? If you've ever watched Boardwalk Empire, everyone's shooting each other up. I mean, you can't get out of the car because, you're likely to Tommy gun's going to take you out. I mean, that's the way it is. So while we think we're safer because of incarceration, we're not. And while a lot of people are actually devastated by incarceration, they're also less safe. So we've got to get straight about whether or not this thing has been affected. And we haven't been able to vote our way out of this so far because the other final dirty secret, and then I'll be quiet, is that mass incarceration has not just eroded our communities and it's not just distorted our economy, it has actually distorted our democracy. Because after the 19th century, we criminalized space, we put people to work, and then we took away their right to vote. And then in 1965, we criminalized space, we put people to work, and we took away their right to vote. And through a very important Supreme Court case, Richardson versus Ramirez, we made it perfectly constitutional to take away people's right to vote if they had a criminal record. By 2006, 48 out of 50 states had disfranchisement legislation on the books. And if you look at the figures, it's not pretty. Plenty of people lost their right to vote. Poli-sci folks, we got some young political scientists. You can read the literature. It'll be very clear. This has actually affected Senate races. It's actually affected local races and national races. It's had a devastating impact on our democracy, and that's not the half of it, because we also have the census. Because in our country, we count people for the census where they are locked up, not where they live, but they can't vote. Okay, so let's be clear on this. You're arrested in Detroit, but you're sent upstate to prison. You can't vote, but your body counts for the voting power where you are locked up. Okay, so that has a 19th century corollary. Let me just shout it out. It's called the 3/5 clause, and it's not pretty. This is Pennsylvania, where I'm from. This is pretty shocking. 8 Pennsylvania House districts would simply not exist if they did not count prisoners who cannot vote as part of their district. And I won't shout out the counties around here, but it is definitely something that's happened in South Carolina too. But again, South Carolina is on the good side of this story. It's on the actual positive side of the story, which is that certain counties, Allendale, Edgefield, Lancaster, Lee, Marlborough, and McCormick, have all actually deliberately and self-consciously avoided this problem, which is what we call prison gerrymandering. But sadly, that is not the case in many other states in this country. And why does this matter? Because we teach our children that if you don't like something in this country, you go to the ballot box and you change it. And yet we have created a system that has effectively meant that the people most affected by the system, most directly, most intimately, literally cannot change the system. And so I leave you with that. And to suggest to you, by the way, census matters, right? Because that's also your dollars for child nutrition programs. That's also resources. So I want to leave you with this idea that, in fact, we are trying to change this. We can change this. And here's the wonderful news about changing this, and we're going to hear more about this from the rest of our speakers. Of the $80 billion spent on incarceration, and this is from our president in a recent speech, if we took that money somewhere else, and that recognizes that some people are going to commit crimes, right? Some people, this isn't going to solve all of it. But of that $80 billion spent on incarceration, this is some of the things we might do instead. Universal pre-K for every 3- and 4-year-old in America. Double the salary of every high school teacher in the United States. Eliminate tuition at every public university and college. And I'll leave it to the legislators to tell us what else we might do with that money. But my guess is a whole lot of amazing things. And I look forward to that and the discussion tonight. Thank you.
Dr. Thompson, thank you so much. A dynamic presentation with so many illustrative points that give us much to think about as we begin to start to think about this second session. And yes, it does cost money here in South Carolina. Matter of fact, spending on corrections over the last 4 or 5 years has averaged anywhere from $550 to $600 million a year, or 7% of the general fund. This is real money, real dollars that are being sucked out of the system that can be used for other social services, perhaps. When we come back after a 15-minute break, we are going to hear from State Senator Gerald Malloy, who recently testified in Washington, D.C. about the sentencing reform efforts here in South Carolina. And he'll be joined by Representative Tommy Pope, whose background and career has been in criminal justice, serving as a former solicitor in 2 counties. We'll have a conversation with both of those men when we return in 15 minutes.